My life has been defined by a number of inequities. These inequities have served as an inflection point in the direction in which my life has taken. I recall as an 8-year-old kid being driven to school by my father and looking out my dad's car window and seeing a kid my age walking in tattered clothing. He was barefoot, and it struck me, and it was the first indication that I ever received in my life that I was privileged, but no better than them. It served as the first inflection point that essentially made me feel that I need to become an agent for change. It made me curious about the world around me. It made me want to know how things work. Why is the world the way it is? And like many of you, I watched American TV shows, and I saw a world that was far advanced compared to ours. And I used to wonder, why is it that way? And what could we do to become that way? Now, fast forward to my late teens, I had the opportunity to travel to Canada to do my university studies, and I chose political science because I felt that if I'm to become an agent of change, I need to study something that essentially enables me to understand the power base of a society and how the resources of a society are managed and apportioned. But while in Canada, the second inflection point in my life happened. I saw how the world perceived Africa, and I was disheartened. Because the way we were portrayed was based on poverty, suffering, disease, hopelessness, war. And you can only imagine what that does to the psyche of a young African who sets out beaming with optimism about the possibilities of life, and then becoming disheartened and disillusioned by the reception you receive. And I recall in many instances, I would introduce myself as an African, and people would respond to me with sympathy. The fact is, it had a tremendous impact on my self-esteem, but it made me motivated. It made me feel that I need to become an example for what it is to be an African. Additionally, something I witnessed, particularly among fellow Africans out there, was that many were slowly resigning to the notion that the decrepit nature of our continent is somehow connected to some fundamental flaw in the people, and that there is no hope for progress. But I refused to embrace this notion, and I decided to be defiant. Now, what does it mean to be defiant? It means to look at the world and take it not for what it is, but for what it can be. Because whenever the status quo is unacceptable, you have to oppose it. You have to defy it. Now, the world as it is has numerous inequities, and the greatest one of all is the one that places Africa as the poorest place on earth, and its people not only the poorest, but met with prejudice all over the world. Now, such a travesty is obviously based on the fact that we have abundant beauty and all the wealth that sits beneath our soil. The centuries past have been unkind to Africa. We've endured slavery, colonial subjugation, and exploitation that has enriched the Western world and left us completely debilitated. But fortunately, because of a perspicacious generation like us, we know that this story is far from over. Now, we could take a look back and take a page out of the book and the story of our forefathers who fought for our independence. They secured our civil, political, and social rights. But there is one key problem. The struggle is incomplete. And you probably have heard this before. There is one key incomplete component: economic liberation. It is our turn to take up the mantle. It is our turn to take on that baton, and it is our turn to be defiant. I decided that when I came to this realization that I need to now start beginning to understand how do I get more involved in economic activities. So I took the third inflection point, shifting my attention towards public policy and matters of political science into more economic affairs. I fell in love with finance. I got involved with venture capital. So we set up it's the pioneering private equity firm here in Zambia. And the reason I did so is because I recognized that there's so much power in equity, power in ownership, because so many products and services are being produced by companies that create value that many of you are spending your money every day that goes somewhere. And I wanted to know, where does that money go? Ultimately, it goes to shareholders. And how can I participate in that value chain? How do I engage with the world and engage with companies and engage in a way that makes me remember my first inflection point? Is how do we create jobs And not only just regular jobs, but jobs that are gainful, that enable gainful employment for the parents of that child walking barefoot in tattered clothing, so their standard of living can increase. And that's the reason I'm so passionate about what I do as a venture capitalist. And we all have various vocations of training and so on, and you don't all have to follow the same path. But for as long as you have that defiant mindset, you know, and of course, if you want to be an agent of change in whatever it is that you do, I think it's important that with that philosophy, you can certainly create enormous impact. Now, I would say we have to be defiant and take hold of our economic destiny, because we know that the status quo is unacceptable. And what is exciting about being a young person at this point in history, in the 21st century, is the fact that the world is more and more connected. We have the internet and numerous technologies that can enable us to provide messaging and communicate with the rest of the world and touch people, or touch billions of people in a matter of seconds. And with that, we can dive deeper into understanding the global supply chain, finance, and so on. And this is actually part of the curiosity. And I'll tell you, what I do for work, aside from raising capital, I have to travel. I have to engage with investors, institutional investors, and tell the story of Africa, and not have the mindset of that insecure kid who was in Canada feeling disillusioned by how the world perceived Africa. I decided to flip it, and that's part of the defiance, and essentially tell a better story and say, this is how we create value, that I will raise this capital and I will create this impact, and it has worked, and I know that it can work for many of you out there, and that's what this call to action is all about. And we need to start thinking more and more and asking questions such as, what is the world consuming? Where are they sourcing the materials? Where are they processing them? And how are they being financed? I have a favorite Bantu saying. It goes, the hand that gives is the hand that rules. And that really informed why I went into venture capital. Because those who provide capital tend to be the ones who direct how economic activity and global trade operate, and I needed to be at that table. It was absolutely necessary. We, as part of our curiosity as Africans in this generation where we are more connected, and today we're dealing with the power of togetherness because we are intertwined in this global village, some of the questions we need to ask is, whatever happens to that raw emerald that comes out of the ground in Lufanyama that winds up adorned by your favorite actress at the Oscars? Whatever happens to that cobalt that comes out of our ground and then becomes Elon Musk's battery-powered innovation? Whatever happens to that mukula, or rosewood tree, that eventually becomes exotic furniture at a palatial estate in China? Apple is now worth more than $1 trillion, worth more than the value of 20 sub-Saharan African countries combined. There is so much value being created in this beautiful continent, and what occurs naturally creates value for corporations all around the world. But what is missing is our involvement. This is why we have to be defiant, because the status quo is completely unacceptable. Now, if we are resolute, and if we are non-negotiable, then we will no longer have to beg for a seat at any table, like our leaders do when they beg for a seat at the UN Security Council, having misplaced priorities, when the indignity of our poverty renders us inconsequential in the eyes of the world. Our brothers and sisters in America will no longer have to try and beg and to convince others that their lives matter, because the state of the place of their origin is directly proportional to their standing in the society they reside. Now, something that we must not take for granted is that, maybe this might sound trivial, but if a kid in Nigeria can make a contact with Kevin Hart through social media, and his work of art enables him to connect and a transaction happens, or perhaps some talented kids out of Uganda connecting with French Montana. It sounds trivial, it sounds funny, but imagine if the same channels could be used where cobalt processors right here in Zambia are connecting directly with Elon Musk at the negotiating table, setting terms, understanding how the value moves from the raw material to where they are, being financed by people like myself, and this is why I got into this game. Imagine if coltan processors out of the Congo, engaging directly with Apple, realizing maximum benefit and value from the resources that they're extracting. We must be involved. And nothing must leave our soil until we are fully involved. Now, part of this is not an issue of black or white or anything of that nature. It's an issue of connectedness. We need to be able to leverage our global connectedness, leveraging the internet, leveraging the fact that the world has become so much smaller, that we can interact, we can engage. Because if a kid like me can go around the world and raise millions of dollars for a little country like Zambia, a little $25 billion economy, then trust me, anything is possible. And I can tell you what, we have to put a stop and block anyone that stands in the way of our agenda. And this tends to happen when certain policymakers take bribes so they could look the other way while our resources are being plundered. Now, when we have this mindset, we will most certainly have our rightful place in the global economy. And that ultimately is what will lead to our economic liberation. I don't want to make this simplistic because ultimately, I just want to open up your eyes to the possibilities of what's out there, whether it be textiles, minerals, capital, you name it. We have so much essential minerals and commodities that the world is consuming. And that's why we need to engage more and more with the rest of the world. We need to interact and intertwine and so on. Now, one of the things that I've always thought of is when I look back at the way the liberation struggle had been forged, there was a lot of collaboration. I saw images of people marching in London, protesting apartheid and so on. And today, there's numerous people who do care about the matters that affect us right here in Africa. So this is why we need to leverage on this international linkage that's out there. Because I truly believe that we came here to leave the world better than we found it. It certainly will not be easy, but we have to be resilient. Something that I dream about is a world where, young Africans can travel around interacting with people of various nationalities and essentially be proud and be received for the glory of their heritage and not have to put their head down. I can foresee a world where the kid that's being driven in the car, that's looking out the car window and seeing kid with tattered clothing, can have lives whose gap is a lot narrowed, so they could see little difference in one another. I believe we came here to leave the world better than we found it, and we must begin to think not of the world of what it is, but for what it can be. Thank you.